Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to talk about Poppies and War Photographer and compare them. So first I'm going to go through Poppies by wear and the language in it. So the first quote I picked out is, "I pinned one on your lapel and spasms of paper red." And this shows how the mother is helping him to get ready as she still sees him as a child. And also almost foreshadows him going to war as she's almost marking him for death by putting this poppy on his lapel, as the adjective spasms has an image of a body like on the floor, like quite injured, and then also a poppy being on the lapel and being red is rather striking and almost looks like a gunshot wound. And then she says how she steeled the softening of my face, and this sibilance makes it sound like she's trying to be brave and she's desperate to appear unafraid and in control in front of her son, as she doesn't want his last memory of her to be of her upset and crying. She's quite cute, it's quite sad. And then she talks about how all my words flattened, rolled, turned into fell and slowly melting, which shows how the mother's composure is now briefly disappearing, which is shown by the melting of her words. The line kind of breaks with the commas because the mother is breaking herself. And then I've got like a treasure chest and intoxicated, which obviously is similar, and it shows how excited the son is and his perspective on this. It's almost like he's drunk with the idea of freedom and going to war, which is quite noble but also quite dangerous. And then she talks about her stomach is busy making tucks, darts and pleats, which shows how she's nervous and highlights her anxiety. And it also sounds domestic, so you can link back to the blazer and her sewing. And then at the end she says how she's hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. And so it's like she's imagining him being gone in a situation like he's gone to school. However, we can indicate here that he's probably died, which is rather sad. And it's like, because she's the mother, like he will always be her child and her baby. And so she longs to hear him again, but we can assume never will. So then we can talk about the themes in Poppies. And so for me the biggest theme is the effects of conflict. So we see even before the son leaves, the mother is rather disattached and clinging on to her son. And then we also see her being rather anxious and restless. For example, her stomach's making the tucks and darts that we talked about earlier. And also we can talk about the theme of loss and absence, as the mother feels like she's lost her son when she leaves, and we can assume she ultimately does lose her son. And we can see this through the focus on the individual war graves, so she's looking at individual lives that have been lost. And also she makes lots of references to senses in the poem. For example, at the end, about hearing his voice catching on the wind, and that shows how she's desperate to find some connection with him, even though we're assuming he's gone. And also the theme of identity, as the son has a new identity now as a soldier, and the mother continues to cling on to her identity as his mother. Now we can talk about form and structure. So the form of this poem is a dramatic monologue, which emphasises how the soldier isn't there, as the mother is the only speaker, and so we get a strong impression of her feelings. And also the structure is in free verse, so reflects natural speech, and there's lots of enjambment, which shows how the narrator is absorbed in her thoughts. And then there's lots of caesura, which shows how she's trying to hold in her emotions and trying to gain some control over the situation. Now I'm going to switch to War Photographer by Duffy and talk about the language in that. So these are completely not in order, so please have your anthology, or else this makes no sense. And the first quote I picked out is Sunday's supplement, and the sibilance in this almost sounds like he's spitting in disgust, as these photos aren't important enough to be in the main newspapers. And I'll just kind of have a quick flip read for people who don't really process it and take it seriously, which we see again in the next simple rhyme with tears and beers, which shows how these tears will quickly be replaced, as people are upset but it will only last a second, and these photos are quickly forgotten. Again, we see this again when he says they do not care. Quite a simple statement here, but it's rather ambiguous, because who's he referring to specifically? He could be talking about the readers of the newspapers or about the world as a whole, which is quite a big statement and is definitely something to consider. And then he talks about how something is happening and there's a half-formed ghost, and this is at the Volta, and so we see the focus now from him doing his job and him being professional to the more personal effects of war on him, and also on the person he is describing, as he's focusing on one person. So he shows the real individual suffering that takes place during war, and we see this photo developing as he's starting to remember. For me, the main theme in this poem is also the effects of conflict, as we see the war photographer's hands tremble, which suggests how he's deeply affected by what he's seeing. And also we can see how the whole world doesn't really have an effect on conflict anymore, as they don't seem to care anymore. They're completely desensitised to this suffering, which is quite important and quite poignant. And then he talks about the theme of memory and how the photographer's memories are triggered by looking at these developing photos. And again, senses emphasise this. So for example, his hands trembling, as we now see the memories kind of triggering him and upsetting him more than when he was actually there, like the real event. So it shows that the reflection of conflict also has a big impact on people. And also we can see the effect of individual experiences, as he talks about being finally alone, as if he needs quiet and space to reflect. And he may also have some guilt, possibly, about his power to escape this conflict, where some people don't have a choice to be in it, and he might feel rather insensitive taking photos instead of helping, but naturally that's his job and he's trying to educate, which is important. I haven't got any form points for this poem, but I've got a structure about how it's a rather regular rhyme scheme and a rather regular structure as a whole, which reflects the photographer's works, as the poem is made up of ordered rows, like ordered stanzas, just like the spools are in ordered rows, which is quite fun. And also we see this as an almost cyclical structure, I think you could argue, as it's kind of fate that war is going to continue and is arguably never going to stop because of the power of man. And so as we see the Sunday supplement of these people not caring, we can imagine that next Sunday it will happen again and people will continue not to be affected by this conflict. So now we can talk about comparing Poppies and War Photographer, which I quite like comparing. I think they go quite well together, but that's rather subjective. And so I'll talk about how both poems explore the suffering caused by conflict. So for War Photographer, he's in a dark room with a red light, which is instantly negative, and obviously we see this theme continue throughout the entire poem. And also its structure being cyclical shows this inescapable cycle of suffering, and also this cycle of people not caring. And then in Poppies there's lots of sad language, and also the form is a dramatic monologue. And also this poem is from a collection called Exit Wounds, which are poems about war, which is significant and about their effect on people. But then we can contrast them and say how in War Photographer the suffering and the sadness that people feel isn't long lasting, as shown by the rhyme of tears and beers. So people are sad for a minute but completely forget afterwards. But then we see this pain and suffering by war to be long term and lasting in Poppies, as we see the mother being constantly sad about her son leaving, and it's not a quick fix, like just forget about it or anything. And also it's in free verse, which again kind of shows a bit of chaos, but then Tajora to show how she's trying to control this and doesn't want to show the effects it has on her, even though it does, unlike War Photographer where it doesn't actually have that long lasting effect on people. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and if you've got any video requests please leave them down below.